Leah's radical far-left opponent is Tammy Baldwin, who wants a socialist takeover of health care. You know, I'm trying to say that very nicely. I'm trying to... See, normally I'd scream, they want a socialist takeover. Now I say, wants a socialist takeover. I'm trying to be nice.
Kind of has the opposite effect, if you point it out. That was President Trump earlier tonight, Wisconsin, toning down his normally vitriolic language and pointing it out to the audience. He joked about the fact that he could not fully attack the Democrats after several explosive devices were mailed to prominent liberals today. He called for Americans to put aside their political differences while then blaming liberals in the media for creating a hostile political climate. But the recipients of the pipe bombs are all frequent targets of Donald Trump's heated rhetoric, insulting political rivals like Hillary Clinton and former President Barack Obama, and the fake news media have become red meat zingers for cheering crowds at his almost daily rallies.
President Obama, along with Brennan and Clapper, they knew about Russia's attempt to interfere in the election in September, and they totally buried it. The radical Democrats held hostage by left-wing haters, angry mobs, socialist fanatics, deep state bureaucrats. You don't give power to an angry left-wing mob. A very dishonest person, crooked Hillary Clinton. The legendary Maxine Waters, a low IQ individual. They'll go to a person holding a sign who gets paid by Soros or somebody, right? That's what happens. These are just dishonest, terrible people. Fake news, enemy of the people. CNN's the worst.
Joining me now, Jennifer Rubin and Jonathan Capehart. Both are opinion writers for The Washington Post and MSNBC contributors. Jonathan is also host of WNYC Radio's national political call-in show, America on the Line. Welcome to both of you. Jennifer, I've been talking about this all day, and I don't even know where to start at this point, other than to say words do matter. And the job of journalists, we'll just start there where he attacked journalists. The job of journalists is to be critical, to speak truth to power, to call out inaccuracies and falsehoods and lies, and to bear witness. And if the result of that work is negative, that's something politicians have to suck up and accept.
That's right. Listen, I think we need to avoid any kind of false equivalence here. It's not simply the political environment is bad. It is certainly not the case that both sides are responsible. There is only one party here who has called for physical violence, either in rallies or cheered a congressman who body slammed a reporter. There's only one party that is making xenophobia and bigotry really the core argument going down the stretch. There's only one candidate, one political figure who has used the Stalinist term enemy of the people. So although it's tempting because everyone wants to be fair, we should be accurate above all. And this is the rhetoric that Donald Trump perfected. This is the rhetoric he used to get himself elected. This is the rhetoric he's returned to as an election is coming forward. And he should accept responsibility for what he has done. Now, no one is saying that he has, instructed or told, or there's any evidence that a bomber directly acted on his words. But we should at least at this point pause and say that he has contributed to this atrocious climate, and that when these things happen, people who are a little bit off or more than a little bit off will take matters into their own hands.
Jonathan Capehart, I mean, at some point, the fear of having that blood on your hands, 6 bombs that we know now may have been potentially bombs. They could have exploded. They weren't fakes. Right. People could have died. This could have been that moment, that day in America that we look back at for 10 or 20 years. Jennifer says there's no place for false equivalency. As you and I were talking before the show, there was only one right response today, and Donald Trump almost got there. And then he became Donald Trump again. Right. And said, but the media, but the critics, but the liberals, but the mob.
This was a day for presidential leadership. This was a day for the leader of the free world to stand up and say that what happened today is not only an attack on our nation and an attack on our values, but it's also an attack on democracy itself when you target elected officials for assassination. The president, and we've talked about this many times, lacks that core element that's needed for the occupant of the Oval Office, and that is empathy. He is an empathetic void. In order for him to do what you just suggested any president should do, it would require him to know, not just intellectually, but intuitively, humanly, that people's lives were put at risk, political opponents' lives were put at risk, and that it was incumbent upon him to put the self aside and put the nation first. But this is not the first time.
No, it's not.
This is not the first time we have seen this happen. And exactly, that is the exact example that comes to mind. And when President Trump reads nice words, I start a stopwatch, because it's only a matter of time before he reverts back to type. Now, he did, in the first half of what he said, was still saying the right words, but he couldn't help himself. And we might see another Charlottesville situation where tomorrow or somewhere in a couple of days
Somehow
he goes
finds a way
full
to
on
compliment, whoever sent these things. Jennifer Rubin, Maxine Waters, Hillary Clinton, Eric Holder, Bill Clinton, George Soros exercise what I call their First Amendment obligations, not just rights. I think it's an obligation to test it. People who, believe in the First Amendment like I do believe that you test it and you push it. So do the Koch brothers. So do a whole lot of other people with whom these people may have various disagreements. At no point does that exercise of your First Amendment obligation cause you to cause there to be a qualification that perhaps you should be subject to a mail bomb, a potential attack. Somehow the president is not understanding that maybe he's fully understanding that he's conflating these two things. Critics of who you are or what you stand for do not qualify for death in America.
Yeah, that would seem to be kind of a basic premise of democracy. But you're right, there's a disconnect. And that's because words and facts don't really mean anything to this president. He uses them indiscriminately. He weaponizes language. And so he really doesn't care whether they wound physically or otherwise. He doesn't care whether they have an effect on people who will then be mocked or ridiculed or discriminated against. So he uses language as a way to stir his own base and to reaffirm that bond he has with that very fringe element in his base. But I want to emphasize something that Jonathan said. It's very easy to simply say, well, there were bombs put in the mail. I think we should call this what it was, a coordinated attempt at mass assassination.
That's right. They were bombs. They were meant to kill people.
They were meant to kill people. A whole set of public officials and former public officials for most likely their political views and ideas. And that is an assassination attempt that we have never seen on this scale with this many people in a single day. And I think it's worth noting. And the fact that the president didn't understand the magnitude of the crime here, the magnitude of the domestic terrorism, and it is domestic terrorism, is somewhat concerning. And that's because, of course, for Trump,
it really is.
For Trump, terrorism isn't terrorism unless there's an Arab he can blame for it. So he doesn't recognize right-wing domestic terrorism as terrorism. But in fact, I went back and I read the definition of domestic terrorism, which is defined. And this does meet it, does meet that definition. So I think we, at least in the media, should be very clear in the use of language. Trump is infamous for conflating language and misusing language, but we should be very clear. We should really call things what they are. And this was a massive attempt at political assassination.
What you're saying, Jennifer, what Jennifer is saying, I've been thinking about this all day because I headed out the first we heard of these bombs and I was covering it all day. Had they succeeded, and there are lots of reasons why they didn't, because the Secret Service intercepts some people's mail and, but had they succeeded, there could have been lots of people dead in America tonight. There's just no space for taking this lightly.
No, there isn't. And, just you're saying it that way, imagine if they had been successful. If just one would have been a tragedy, but two or three or four, at some point, someone, or actually, it shouldn't be just one person, it should be a group of people who stand up and say, enough is enough. We've had enough of this. It is time to change direction. Under normal circumstances, you could easily look to the President of the United States to be that moral exemplar to push us in a new direction.
Right.
We don't have that.
Right.
And so now it is incumbent upon Speaker Paul Ryan, for the remaining weeks he's Speaker, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell, to join with other Americans and say this is unacceptable, not just because pipe bombs were sent, but the next time he goes off the deep end with his rhetoric.
I don't know if that's going to happen. That's wishful thinking. But the first part, at least, some of them lived up to today. We did hear from Paul Ryan and others who didn't qualify their condemnation of this thing in any fashion. And I, for one, am appreciative of that. I'm appreciative for both of you tonight. Thank you, Jonathan Capehart and Jennifer Rubin, for doing what you're doing, for being committed journalists who do speak truth to power, who do challenge inaccuracies, and who do bear witness. It's important.
Thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on the button below for more from The Last Word and the rest of MSNBC.